Hey, I'm Matthew, and today we're looking at the deadliest ego trips ever taken above the tree line. From a boulder couple who turned Mount Everest into a wedding venue and ignored every warning their guide gave them, to a family who thought a 2-ton boulder on the Matterhorn was a prop for their vacation footage. It was February 22nd, 2018, on the Matterhorn's north face at 13,400 feet elevation. The snowpack had been unstable for weeks. Multiple storm cycles throughout February had deposited heavy snow on weak layers, and avalanche warnings had been issued for north-facing slopes above 12,000 feet. Lukas Stahl was 34 years old, a software developer from Munich, Germany. He had been climbing seriously for 8 years and had completed numerous alpine routes, including several difficult winter ascents. His climbing partners described him as talented but impatient, someone who pushed limits and didn't like waiting. He had been planning a winter ascent of the Matterhorn's north face for 2 years, studying route conditions and weather patterns obsessively. The north face is significantly more technical and dangerous than the standard Hearnley ridge, requiring advanced ice climbing skills and experience with objective hazards like avalanches and rockfall. Lukas had a narrow weather window, a few days of relatively stable conditions, forecasted before a major storm system moved in. He decided to attempt the climb solo, believing he could move faster alone. The Matterhorn's north face is a 3,000-foot wall of ice, rock, and snow, angled steeply in most sections. Winter conditions add extreme cold, shorter daylight, and increased avalanche risk. February 2018 had seen heavy snowfall across the Alps, with multiple storm cycles depositing several feet of new snow on existing layers. Avalanche danger was rated as considerable to high across the region. Avalanches occur when a weak layer in the snowpack fails under the weight of snow above it, often triggered by the weight or movement of a climber. Slab avalanches can release massive amounts of snow moving at high speeds. On steep faces, there is no escape. Climbers are swept downward, buried, and subjected to massive, blunt force trauma from tumbling snow, ice, and rock. Local avalanche forecasts for the week warned of persistent weak layers in the snowpack, particularly on north-facing slopes above 12,000 feet. Several climbing routes in the area had been closed or advised against. Lukas reviewed the reports but believed his experience and speed would mitigate the risk. He left the base of the north face in the early morning hours, carrying minimal gear to stay light and fast. Conditions were cold, around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, with light wind. He made good progress, climbing efficiently through mixed rock and ice. By mid-morning, he was at approximately 13,000 feet, well up the face. He noticed small sloughs of snow sliding past him periodically, minor releases that didn't concern him. Later, he entered a steep couloir filled with wind-loaded snow. The snow felt dense and consolidated under his ice tools, but hollow sounds echoed when he kicked his crampons in, a sign of air gaps and weak layers beneath the surface. He moved quickly, wanting to exit the couloir as fast as possible. Lukas was several hundred feet up the couloir, roughly 13,400 feet elevation. He placed his ice axe into the snow above his head and weighted it. The snow fractured. A crack shot horizontally across the slope, propagating in both directions. The entire section of slope released as a slab, breaking free as a single cohesive block. Lukas was ripped off the face instantly. There was no time to self-arrest or deploy any protection. The avalanche carried him downward, tumbling him violently within the moving mass of snow. His body was thrown against rock outcrops and ice formations as the debris funneled down the couloir. The avalanche traveled over 1,000 vertical feet before slowing and depositing its load in a debris field at the base of the couloir. A solo climber approaching the base of the north face from a different route witnessed the avalanche and saw the debris cloud. He approached cautiously once the snow settled and began searching the debris field. He used an avalanche probe and located a body buried under several feet of compacted snow. He began digging and uncovered Lukas within minutes. Lukas was not breathing and had no pulse. His body showed severe trauma. His helmet was shattered, and there were obvious fractures and deformities. The climber radioed for help. A rescue team reached the site by early afternoon and confirmed death at the scene. Lukas's body was extracted from the debris and transported down by helicopter later that day. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as multiple blunt force trauma sustained during the avalanche, with severe head and chest injuries consistent with high velocity impact against rock and ice. Asphyxiation from snow burial was also noted, though the traumatic injuries were likely immediately fatal. The avalanche was classified as a climber-triggered slab avalanche on a slope with known instability. Lucas's family was notified within hours. His body was released several days later. It was October 9th, 2014, and over 1,000 miles south of the Himalayas. Weather forecasters stared at satellite imagery showing a red swirl developing over the Andaman Sea. The system was intensifying rapidly, ocean temperatures feeding energy into what would soon become a severe cyclonic storm. Meanwhile, in the town of Basisahar, Nepal, the reality could not have felt more different. Clear skies stretched overhead, and a light breeze carried the scent of juniper smoke and diesel fuel through the narrow streets. Stephen Fabes, a physician from Oxford, UK, stood near the edge of town decorating his bicycle with brightly colored prayer flags. At 34, he was 5 years into an ambitious journey to cycle the length of 6 continents, documenting the experience through writing and photography. Beside him worked Mike Roy, an American cyclist he had met the previous month while riding through India. Mike was 2 years into his own ride through Asia, and when both men realized they had the Annapurna circuit on their agendas, they decided to tackle it together. The Annapurna circuit was one of the world's most famous trekking routes, a 150-mile trail that swept around 15 Himalayan peaks, topping 23,000 feet. The highest among them was Annapurna 1, rising to 26,545 feet and carrying a reputation as one of the deadliest 8,000ers in the range. The circuit itself attracted over 20,000 hikers and bikers annually, with more than 5,000 attempting it each October alone when weather conditions were typically at their most stable. As Stephen and Mike finalized their preparations, meteorologists continued monitoring the developing system to the south. By that evening, Cyclone Hudhud had been upgraded to a very severe cyclonic storm, with sea winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. India began mass evacuations along its coastal towns in the Bay of Bengal, moving hundreds of thousands of people inland ahead of the projected landfall. No warnings reached Nepal's trekking routes. Stephen and Mike cruised through Basisahar under perfect conditions, pedaling and occasionally carrying their bikes over the rock-strewn road that wound upward through terraced fields and pine forests. They were both experienced cyclists, accustomed to self-supported travel through remote regions, and the circuit represented a natural extension of their journeys. The route typically required between 12 and 22 days, depending on acclimatization schedules and chosen detours, with most trekkers hiring porters to carry supplies while they focused on managing the altitude. The circuit was classified as an entry-level trek, accessible to anyone with a reasonable level of fitness and determination. But that designation came with caveats. The risks were real and well documented. Altitude sickness could strike anyone regardless of conditioning. Terrain ranged from dirt roads to exposed mountain passes. Falls were common on steep sections, and the Himalayan weather carried a reputation for unpredictability that demanded respect. Nepal saw approximately 750,000 tourists annually, and the Annapurna circuit accounted for a significant portion of that traffic. More than 1,000 registered trekking agencies operated throughout the country, and every trekker paid a mandatory $20 fee to the Trekkers Information Management System, a government-run program designed specifically to assist with safety monitoring and search and rescue operations. The system required check-ins at various waypoints along major routes, theoretically allowing authorities to track who was where and respond to emergencies with accurate information. On October 12th, Cyclone Hudhud made landfall near Visakhapatnam on India's eastern coast with sustained winds of approximately 115 miles per hour, killing over 120 people and causing billions of dollars in damage. India's early warning system and mass evacuations prevented a far higher death toll. Meanwhile, the remnants of the storm continued pushing northward toward the Himalayas. Nepal's Department of Hydrology and Meteorology issued a general forecast predicting heavy rainfall, but the warning never reached trekking routes in any actionable form. No alerts were posted at permit checkpoints, no guest house owners along the circuit were contacted, and no mechanism existed to relay urgent weather information to the thousands of hikers already on the trail. Over the following 4 days, Stephen and Mike pedaled and hiked steadily upward, gaining altitude through small villages where guest houses offered simple meals and basic lodging. The weather remained clear, the temperatures comfortable during the day and cold at night, and the only challenges came from the physical effort of moving bikes and gear through increasingly vertical terrain. On Monday, October 13th, they arrived in Manang, a village perched at 11,500 feet, approximately 2 days from Thorong La Pass, the circuit's highest point at 17,769 feet. The afternoon air carried a high-altitude chill that gave weight to each breath, and rosy-cheeked children bundled in so many layers they could barely bend their arms ran out to greet the arriving trekkers. Manang served as a critical acclimatization stop for most groups, and the village buzzed with climbers reviewing weather forecasts and adjusting their schedules. That afternoon, Stephen noticed a fleet of ragged gray clouds driving up the valley from the south, their shapes dark against the surrounding peaks. The shift felt sudden after days of unbroken blue skies. That evening, he walked outside their guest house and looked up at a starless sky. Snow was falling, not heavily, just scattered white specks drifting down through still air. It seemed unremarkable, perhaps even picturesque. He went back inside without much thought. The morning of Tuesday, October 14th, arrived with a white glare that wrestled Stephen from sleep. Light penetrated through the window in a way that felt wrong, too bright and diffuse. He sat up and stared at approximately 2 feet of snow overhanging the metal roof of their room, the weight causing the structure to groan and shift. Mike woke beside him, and both men sat in stunned silence. October in Manang meant brochure blue skies and crisp, clear mornings. It did not mean blizzards. What they did not yet know was that the remnants of Cyclone Hudhud had merged with an upper-level weather trough, creating a meteorological event that experts would later call the worst storm to hit the region in a decade. Nearly 6 feet of snow would fall within 12 hours across the upper sections of the circuit, a volume that transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable and presented an immediate, life-threatening challenge to everyone caught in its path. No weather warnings had been issued at any of the trekking permit checkpoints they had passed on their way up. The power was out, the phone lines dead, and the village had transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. Stephen and Mike made the only decision that seemed reasonable. They stayed put. They spent the day reading, crowding around a stove fueled by dried yak dung, and watching through frosted windows as more hikers arrived from lower elevations throughout the afternoon. Manang filled with stranded adventurers, all staring at the same white sky and wondering how long the storm would last. Higher on the mountain, more than 200 hikers were departing from Thorong Phidi at 14,600 feet and High Camp at 15,900 feet. Many wore sneakers and jeans, clothing choices that reflected both inadequate research and the assumption that October weather on the Annapurna circuit posed minimal risk. The initial snowfall appeared light. Flurries were not uncommon, even during the dry season at 17,000 feet, and most groups departed with hopes that the precipitation would diminish as they climbed. The wind was blowing east to west, which meant a tailwind pushed most trekkers toward the pass, making the climb feel easier than it was, and encouraging groups to continue when conditions were already deteriorating. An American couple from Michigan left Thorong Phidi around 8 a.m. with a small group of other hikers, beginning the steep climb toward High Camp. Over the next hour, they gained approximately 1,500 feet through snow that was accumulating faster than expected. During the ascent, they witnessed an avalanche thunder down a slope not far from their route, the sound rolling through the valley like sustained artillery fire. The snowfall was intensifying rapidly now, visibility deteriorating into full whiteout conditions where the ground became indistinguishable from the sky. The couple reached High Camp and decided immediately to wait out the storm rather than continue toward the pass. A young mountain guide from Colorado was already at High Camp when the weather worsened. He had planned to cross Thorong La that morning, but was experiencing dizziness and a persistent headache, telltale signs of altitude sickness that his professional training had taught him never to ignore. He decided to remain at High Camp and monitor his symptoms. Throughout the morning, he watched scores of trekkers depart into the increasing snowfall, and the sight filled him with unease. Many didn't appear to be seasoned hikers. Their movements were uncertain, their gear inadequate, and their pace suggested they were already struggling with the altitude before adding the storm to their burden. He would later express deep concern about what he witnessed that morning. The snowfall continued heavily throughout Tuesday, and temperatures dropped dramatically as the storm strengthened. Visibility reduced to near zero in the whiteout, and the wind began driving snow horizontally across exposed slopes. Many of the trekkers on the route had little to no backcountry experience. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. They were tourists who had paid for guided expeditions and assumed their safety was guaranteed by that transaction. Some of the guides themselves were not well trained or properly equipped for emergency conditions. Each person scattered across the upper mountain faced the same critical decisions: continue forward, hoping to reach the far side of the pass, turn back through terrain that was already becoming difficult to navigate, or find shelter and hope the storm would pass before hypothermia set in. At high camp that afternoon, those who had decided to wait layered every piece of clothing they carried and retreated into sleeping bags, huddling together in the stone huts for warmth. Around mid-afternoon, a couple burst through the door, their faces pale and their movements jerky with cold. They had left high camp that morning, attempting to reach the pass, but became completely lost in the whiteout. Visibility had dropped to nothing. The trail markers were buried, and they had wandered aimlessly through the snow for hours before spotting a dark shape moving through the blur. It was a porter leading his horse back down toward high camp, and the couple followed him to safety. Later that afternoon, another porter arrived at high camp carrying a hastily written note. The message was brief and terrifying. Israeli trekkers were stuck somewhere high on the pass in mortal danger and needed immediate help. The note would eventually reach the Israeli embassy in Kathmandu, which became one of the first international bodies to raise an alarm and call for rescue assistance. But at high camp, those gathered in the stone hut could only look at each other with growing dread. The trail was buried under fast-falling snow that had erased any trace of the path. The route to the pass was no longer visible, and visibility remained near zero. The reality settled over the group like a physical weight. An unknown number of people were scattered across Thorong La in deadly conditions, and there was no way to reach them without getting lost in the same whiteout that had trapped them. Maya Ora, a young Israeli trekker, had departed high camp earlier that morning with a large group of friends. Their guides had assessed the conditions and told the group it was acceptable to proceed. Maya trusted that judgment. They were paying for professional guidance, and she had no experience that would allow her to second-guess the decision. The group battled whiteout conditions and heavy snow before finally reaching a small stone hut that served as a tea house shelter. The structure was already packed with frightened trekkers when they arrived, bodies pressed together in the confined space with barely room to sit. Nearly everyone inside showed signs of hypothermia. Skin was pale, speech was slurred, and violent shivering had started giving way to the dangerous stillness that marked advancing cold exposure. Many lacked proper equipment. They had not packed extra sleeping bags or sufficient warm layers because October was supposed to be safe. The temperature inside the stone hut remained dangerously cold despite the press of bodies, and trekkers huddled together, attempting to share whatever warmth remained. Some climbers struggled with the cramped conditions, the lack of personal space adding psychological stress to the physical deterioration everyone was experiencing. As the hours stretched on, porters and guides inside the stone hut began approaching tourists with offers. For money, sometimes hundreds of dollars, they would lead climbers down the mountain to safety. It was a brutal marketplace, desperation, meeting opportunity, and multiple trekkers paid for the assistance. Some of Maya's friends handed over cash and left with the guides who promised to navigate them through the storm. At one point, the tea house owner himself decided to evacuate the shelter entirely, telling everyone to leave and promising to guide them down through the storm. Of the roughly 30 people who followed him out into the blizzard, only a handful made it safely to the nearest village. Over the next 20 hours, those who remained endured cold that penetrated through every layer of clothing and sleeping bag insulation. Energy reserves depleted as bodies burned calories trying to maintain core temperature in conditions where warmth was impossible to sustain. Somewhere else on the route, scattered among the whiteout and buried trail markers, an English hiker was fighting his own battle with navigation. He would later describe to media the surreal quality of the storm. How the ground had become the same color as the sky, how it had become impossible to tell which direction was up and which was down. During a brief respite in the weather, he spotted a pole marking the trail, a single reference point in a landscape that had become entirely featureless. Over the next 2 hours, he picked his way downhill through a maze of trail poles that sometimes vanished for minutes at a time, navigating by memory and instinct between brief glimpses of the next marker. He believed approximately 10 people were following his navigation through the storm. It turned out to be closer to 150 people following in his tracks, trusting a stranger's judgment because there were no other options available. The morning of Wednesday, October 15th, brought a critical decision for those still trapped in the stone hut. After approximately 20 hours inside, the conditions had become unbearable. The cold had seeped into bones. Hypothermia was advancing, and remaining stationary felt increasingly like waiting to die. Maya and 6 friends made the decision to leave and attempt the descent. Upon stepping outside, the blizzard immediately engulfed them. Visibility remained extremely poor. They could not see more than a few feet in any direction. The trail was buried under approximately 5 feet of snow, and no visible path remained to guide them downward. The only markers they could identify were bodies and abandoned bags. Maya would later describe the scene to media in words that struggled to capture the horror. Walking between corpses and scattered gear, recognizing dead friends and the bodies of guides half buried in the snow, dozens of them, frozen where they had collapsed. She couldn't count them all. Many were already disappearing beneath the drifts, and she knew some would never be found. The group pushed forward for hours without any clear sense of direction, praying they were descending rather than climbing higher or wandering laterally across exposed slopes. Eventually, they reached a lower village where helicopters were staging rescue operations. Maya and her friends were evacuated to safety. They were among the fortunate. That same morning, Stephen woke in Manang to blue sky. The storm had passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the Annapurnas gleaming white in morning sunlight. Gusts whipped plumes of snow from the upper reaches of the peaks, but the air felt different, clearer, calmer, carrying the promise that the worst had ended. Power had returned to the village, and when Stephen found a working internet connection, he pulled up BBC News and felt his stomach drop. The headlines reported deaths on the Annapurna circuit. Initial numbers were vague. 9 bodies identified, at least 140 people still missing. Stephen joined the anxious crowds of trekkers surrounding Manang's few functioning computers, everyone desperately trying to email families and loved ones to confirm they were safe. Websites began publishing lists of hikers with status updates beside each name. Safe, deceased, unknown, unknown, unknown. The repetition of that word, unknown, carried a weight that grew heavier with each refresh of the page. The drone of helicopters became constant throughout the day. Nepali government helicopters painted olive green joined the bright red search and rescue models, and the aircraft shuttled back and forth between the upper mountain and Pokhara, ferrying the dead and injured down to hospitals and morgues. This was becoming the biggest rescue effort ever conducted in the region. The scale of the operation made clear that the death toll would climb significantly from the initial reports. Foreign doctors volunteering at Manang's medical clinic set up a triage station to handle the anticipated flood of patients. They treated hikers who had suffered snow blindness while attempting to trek to ridges surrounding the town, providing eye patches and pain medication before sending them on to lower elevations. When Stephen checked in to see if his medical training could be useful, he found the clinic eerily quiet. Scores of hikers remained stranded at higher elevations, and those being rescued from the pass by helicopter were being flown directly to the hospital in Pokhara rather than stopping in Manang. The anticipated rush of patients never materialized. The clinic sat mostly empty while helicopters thundered overhead, carrying the dead and dying past the village toward more capable facilities. The avalanche risked decreasing and snow beginning to melt under strong sun. Stephen and Mike decided to set out for the pass on foot. Turning back now would feel like defeat, and they wanted to see how far they could safely travel. They were among the only people ascending now. Everyone else was retreating or waiting for helicopter evacuation. En route, they met more hikers coming down from higher elevations, and the conversations were brief and hollow. Nobody wanted to linger on what they had seen. A retreating hiker pointed to a shape by the river below the trail, a body. Stephen and Mike walked over to the location. It was a monk, lying on his side in the snow with his head resting on a red rucksack. A blanket had been draped over his legs, and one of his hands was balled into a fist as if still gripping something. The body was frozen solid, ice crystals forming across exposed skin. An army helicopter hovered above them, the rotor wash kicking up snow and debris as the crew prepared to lower recovery equipment. Stephen and Mike continued trekking in silence after the helicopter lifted away with its cargo. They passed sprawls of avalanche debris that looked like frozen ocean waves, pale and chaotic across the slopes. They found footprints in the snow heading in the opposite direction, tracks left by people who had successfully descended and were now safe in lower villages. The sight of those footprints felt like evidence of survival, small proof that escape had been possible for some. At high camp, Stephen's head ached with altitude, the thin air making thought feel sluggish and heavy. They were now the only foreigners at this elevation, aside from one Chinese hiker who was also attempting to continue upward. Everyone else had either turned back or been airlifted out by the rescue helicopters. After a brief rest, Stephen and Mike continued climbing toward the pass. Within an hour, they encountered waist-deep snow that made forward progress nearly impossible. Stephen had emailed his family hours earlier, assuring them he was safe and accounted for. The thought of forcing through unstable snow and risking an avalanche now seemed absurd. Both men decided the risk was too high. They turned around and began descending back toward Manang. More than 500 people were rescued from the region in the week following the storm, including over 300 foreign trekkers. At least 43 died, 21 trekkers and guides on the circuit, 3 yak herders and others on nearby peaks. Beyond the deaths, 175 people suffered injuries, many with severe frostbite that later required limb amputations. Victims came from Canada, Israel, Poland, Slovakia, India, Vietnam, Japan, and Nepal. The cyclone had been predicted days in advance, yet no weather warnings reached the route. Every trekker paid $20 to a government safety system that had collected millions in fees over the years, but never built a communication network capable of warning hikers already on the trail. It could track who entered a route, but couldn't reach them once they were on it. Nepal's prime minister promised improvements. The Himalayas remained as beautiful as before. Tranquility had returned as quickly as it had vanished. It was August 3rd, 2015, on the Matterhorn's Hearnley Ridge, Swiss side, at 13,200 feet elevation. The weather window was closing faster than forecasted. Clouds were building from the south earlier than expected, and wind speeds were picking up along the exposed ridgeline. Craig Hollis was 38 years old, a financial analyst from Boston, Massachusetts. He worked long hours and prided himself on physical fitness, running marathons and competing in triathlons. Friends described him as driven and competitive, someone who didn't like to quit. He had no mountaineering experience beyond a single guided climb of Mount Rainier the previous summer. He booked a guided Matterhorn climb through a commercial alpine service. His goal was to summit a major European peak and add it to his growing list of athletic accomplishments. He arrived in Switzerland 4 days before the climb, but spent most of that time at low elevation, sightseeing rather than acclimatizing. The Hearnley Ridge ascent covers 4,000 vertical feet of technical scrambling from the mountain hut to the summit. The route crosses exposed rock ridges, where wind speeds can exceed 40 miles per hour. August weather in the Alps is unpredictable, with afternoon thunderstorms common. At elevations above 12,000 feet, the body requires significantly more oxygen for exertion, and inadequate acclimatization leads to rapid fatigue, headaches, nausea, and impaired judgment. Hypothermia can set in quickly when exhaustion combines with wind and dropping temperatures. The Matterhorn's ridgeline offers little shelter, and retreat becomes increasingly difficult as fatigue deepens. The weather forecast called for clear skies until early afternoon, with clouds building later. The guide planned an early departure to ensure a midday summit and descent before conditions worsened. Craig woke up complaining of a headache, which he attributed to poor sleep. He took ibuprofen and said he was ready to go. The group of 4 clients and 2 guides left on schedule. Within the first hour, Craig was breathing heavily and falling behind. His guide checked in multiple times, and Craig insisted he was fine, just warming up. By mid-morning, at roughly 12,400 feet, he was visibly struggling, stopping frequently, hands on knees, face flushed. His guide suggested turning back, but Craig refused. The group slowed its pace to accommodate him. By late morning, they were still well below the summit, and clouds were beginning to build from the south. The group reached roughly 13,800 feet, several hundred feet below the summit. Craig was moving slowly, his coordinations visibly impaired. He stumbled twice on easy terrain and needed verbal prompting to clip into fixed ropes. His speech was slurred when he spoke. The wind had picked up considerably, and the temperature had dropped into the low 40s degrees Fahrenheit. The guide made the call to turn around. Craig protested weakly, but lacked the energy to argue. The descent began shortly after. Within 20 minutes, Craig stopped moving. He sat down on the rock and said he needed to rest. His guide urged him to keep moving, explaining that stopping in the wind would cause his body temperature to drop. Craig nodded but didn't stand. His eyes were half closed, and his responses were delayed. The guide physically pulled him to his feet, but Craig's legs buckled. He sat back down. The second guide moved up to assist, and together they tried to keep Craig upright and moving. His core temperature was dropping. He began shivering violently, then stopped shivering altogether, a sign of advancing hypothermia. His skin was pale, his lips blue. The guides radioed for emergency assistance and began attempting to insulate him with extra layers and an emergency bivvy. Craig lost consciousness shortly after. CPR was initiated, but his pulse was undetectable. A helicopter was dispatched, but couldn't reach the location due to cloud cover and high winds. The guides continued resuscitation efforts. Craig never regained consciousness. The weather cleared enough by late afternoon for a helicopter to extract Craig's body and the rest of the group. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe hypothermia, complicated by acute altitude sickness and exhaustion. Contributing factors included inadequate acclimatization, overexertion beyond physical capacity, and prolonged exposure to cold and wind in an immobilized state. The guide's decision-making was reviewed and found to be appropriate. The turnaround call had been made at the correct time, but Craig's condition deteriorated faster than could be managed in the field. His family was notified that evening. His body was released several days later and returned to the United States. It was May 15th, 2006, high on Mount Everest's northeast ridge, where the climb entered its most unforgiving stretch. At 27,890 feet, Green Boots Cave sat directly on the route, an exposed limestone alcove in the death zone, where oxygen levels drop below what the human body can sustain, and even standing still accelerates failure. That morning, temperatures hovered between -35 and -45 degrees Fahrenheit, with steady 25 miles per hour winds driving lethal wind chill, turning the slope into a place where stopping for minutes, not hours, could cost another life. One climber pursuing his Everest climb was David James Sharp, a 34-year-old engineer from Gisborough, Yorkshire, known for a precise, analytical mindset. With a mathematics background and a career in telecommunications, he treated climbing as a problem to be solved through research, planning, and systems rather than instinct. Months before the expedition, he immersed himself in route studies, weather data, and equipment limits, believing careful preparation could manage even Everest's most extreme risks. Sharp's final expedition did not come from inexperience. Before Everest, he had completed 2 successful ascents of Cho Oyu in 2003 and 2005, reaching above 8,000 meters and proving his ability to function at extreme altitude. Cho Oyu became his proving ground, where he tested how his body responded to thin air and refined a minimalist system built around self-reliance rather than heavy support. Friends and former partners described him as technically capable and intensely prepared, though consistently wary of the large-scale logistics that defined modern Everest expeditions. His first Everest attempt came in 2003 with a British-led team that included Richard Dugan and Jamie McGuinness. While only part of the group reached the summit, the expedition suffered no fatalities, and Dugan later noted that Sharp acclimatized well and was among the strongest climbers on the team. When frostbite began to develop near the upper mountain, the group turned back together. During the descent, Sharp assisted a struggling Spanish climber, sharing oxygen before ultimately losing several toes to frostbite himself. In 2004, Sharp returned to Everest's north side with a Franco-Austrian team led by Hugues Dobarade. He climbed to roughly 8,500 meters, but stopped short of the summit after falling behind the lead group. That expedition highlighted a growing philosophical divide. Sharp opposed the use of supplemental oxygen and objected to heavily supported climbs, a position he expressed openly in emails and discussions. Although he temporarily accepted oxygen as part of the group, the disagreement lingered. He also suffered additional frostbite to his fingers during the attempt. These earlier expeditions shaped the climb that would later define his legacy. Sharp returned in 2006 committed to a solo, oxygen-free ascent, drawing on years of high-altitude experience, repeated exposure above 8,000 meters, and a belief that preparation and restraint could replace support. What those earlier climbs could not prepare him for was how quickly isolation, timing, and the death zone's limits would converge, leaving no margin when his body finally failed high above Green Boots Cave. Sharp followed an alpine-style climbing philosophy, moving upward with minimal gear, no supplemental oxygen, and no support team to fall back on. Every decision, pace, rest, descent, was his alone, with no margin built in for failure. Even after earlier expeditions cost him several toes and fingertips to frostbite, he doubled down on that approach, returning to the mountain already physically diminished and knowingly removing the last safety net most climbers rely on. By choosing purity over redundancy, he accepted a version of Everest where mistakes are not corrected. They are absorbed by the body until it gives out. That decision became lethal in Mount Everest's death zone, which begins around 26,000 feet. At that height, atmospheric pressure drops to roughly 1/3 of sea level, and the body starts failing by design. Blood oxygen levels plunge, the heart races even at rest, and the brain loses the ability to judge risk or recognize collapse in real time. Each step higher creates a physiological debt the body can't repay, one that quietly erases strength, clarity, and the ability to save yourself long before you realize anything is wrong. As that debt accumulates, judgment and coordination deteriorate, exposure injuries accelerate, and altitude illnesses like cerebral and pulmonary edema become more likely, with blood diverted from the extremities to preserve vital organs. Frostbite can set in rapidly, while cold wind and oxygen loss combine to make rescue increasingly dangerous. Above 26,000 feet, even stable conditions can collapse without warning, turning minutes into the difference between survival and another life lost. That morning, Sharp traveled to Kathmandu to finalize preparations for his third Everest attempt. During this visit, he met with Jamie McGuinness, an experienced expedition leader who had successfully guided multiple Everest expeditions and maintained detailed knowledge of current mountain conditions. McGuinness offered Sharp a place on a fully supported climb for approximately the same cost as Sharp's independent expedition, recognizing that Sharp's experience level warranted better support systems than his solo approach provided. The offer included comprehensive logistical support, including Sherpa assistance, fixed rope systems, supplemental oxygen, weather monitoring, communication equipment, and emergency backup protocols developed through years of expedition management. However, Sharp declined the offer after carefully considering the terms, stating he was unwilling to accept what he viewed as constraints on his climbing style. His rejection centered on philosophical differences about mountaineering approaches rather than financial considerations or personality conflicts with McGuinness or his team. McGuinness later reflected that Sharp's refusal concerned him professionally, as he recognized the additional risks inherent in solo climbing at extreme altitude, particularly for climbers attempting routes without supplemental oxygen. The conversation highlighted fundamental disagreements within the mountaineering community about acceptable risk levels and the role of support systems in high-altitude climbing, but choosing independence meant accepting its consequences. Sharp proceeded with his independent expedition plan, booking permits through a Chinese mountaineering agency and arranging minimal logistical support for transportation to base camp and basic equipment resupply. He arrived at Everest Base Camp on the Tibetan side in early May 2006, establishing his expedition headquarters among dozens of other climbing teams preparing for summit attempts during the traditional spring climbing season. The 2006 climbing season was more hostile than average, with repeated storms compressing summit attempts into brief weather windows lasting just 24 to 48 hours. At base camp, set at 17,056 feet on the Rongbuk Glacier, climbers made their final preparations, relying on forecasts and limited supplies before committing to the upper mountain. Forecasts suggested a short, high-pressure window beginning May 14th, offering reduced winds and clearer skies, but for an independent climber with minimal support, those conditions also meant a narrow margin for delay or recovery. Sharp set his climb along the standard Mount Everest Northeast Ridge from the Tibetan side, a route favored by independent climbers for its fixed infrastructure and relatively predictable conditions compared to the south side. From the plateau of Tibet, the route moved upward in clear stages. Advanced base camp at 21,300 feet served as the final logistical hub, while the climb to North Col at 23,000 feet marked the first true barrier, where wind exposure and sustained cold began to dominate movement. Above that, Camp 2 at 24,500 feet functioned as a staging area for higher rotations, and Camp 3 at 27,390 feet sat just below the death zone's most punishing terrain, where oxygen levels dropped sharply and recovery became increasingly limited. Each of these camps played a specific role in the climb. Supplies were cached, equipment was adjusted, and time was deliberately spent allowing the body to adapt before moving higher. Progress above one camp was never intended to be permanent at first. Climbers climbed high, then descended, repeating the cycle to force physiological adaptation, while minimizing the risk of sudden altitude collapse. Sharp moved through this system in early May, following established acclimatization practices. He limited increases in sleeping altitude to roughly 1,000 feet per day above 10,000 feet and incorporated rest days at key elevations, particularly after reaching North Col and Camp 2. Medical observations during this period showed expected adaptation responses, including increased red blood cell production and improved oxygen efficiency. By the time he positioned himself for a summit attempt, there were no signs that his acclimatization was failing, only that he was operating at the outer edge of what the human body can tolerate without support. On May 14th, Sharp began his final ascent from Camp 3 toward Everest's 29,032-foot summit. Climbing conditions that morning appeared favorable, with wind speeds below 20 miles per hour and temperatures around negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit, within acceptable parameters for summit attempts. Sharp's climbing pace without supplemental oxygen significantly slowed his progress compared to teams using bottled oxygen systems, as his body had to function on approximately one-third the oxygen availability of sea level conditions. His route from Camp 3 followed fixed ropes installed by earlier expedition teams, providing safety anchors and route-finding assistance through the most technical sections. Evidence from other climbing teams suggests Sharp reached the summit around 4 p.m. on May 14th, several hours later than the generally accepted safe return time of 2 p.m. for climbers operating without supplemental oxygen. McGuinness later stated that reaching the summit at 4 p.m. without oxygen might as well be equivalent to summiting in the middle of the night on the moon, emphasizing how dangerous late-day summit times become at extreme altitude. The late summit timing meant Sharp faced descent through the most technical and dangerous sections of the route in darkness and deteriorating weather conditions, when hypothermia risk increased dramatically and navigation became significantly more challenging. During his descent, Sharp moved into rapidly worsening conditions. After sunset, temperatures dropped to between -30 and -40 degrees Fahrenheit, while rising winds stripped heat from exposed skin and accelerated loss of core body temperature. The physical cost of the summit effort, combined with oxygen deprivation and cold, slowed his movement and degraded coordination. At extreme altitude, these factors also reduce the body's ability to generate heat, turning pauses into compounding setbacks rather than moments of recovery. Sometime late that night, likely between 11 p.m. and midnight, Sharp left the fixed descent line and entered Green Boots Cave, a shallow limestone alcove at 27,890 feet. The cave already contained the preserved remains of Sewang Paljor, who had died there a decade earlier. The location was well known to climbers on the northeast ridge, not as a shelter, but as a waypoint marking proximity to the summit and the beginning of the most dangerous stretch of descent. Green Boots Cave offered limited protection from direct wind, but little else. The alcove measured roughly 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, with a low ceiling that forced anyone inside to crouch or sit. That position restricted circulation, reduced heat generation, and made it increasingly difficult to stand or move once cold set in. With no insulation beyond clothing and no active heat source, body temperature continued to drop even while inside the shelter. Entering the cave marked a critical turning point. While it reduced immediate wind exposure, it also halted continuous descent, the only action that could have slowed hypothermia and oxygen loss. At 27,890 feet, every hour spent stationary further drained strength and coordination. As body temperature fell and muscle function declined, the ability to leave the cave and rejoin the route narrowed rapidly, turning a pause into effective entrapment at an altitude where recovery was no longer possible. That isolation was compounded by the fact that Sharp was climbing outside any formal expedition structure. He had not registered a summit push, carried no radio or satellite phone, and had not told anyone when he planned to go for the top. Although other climbers saw him ascending earlier, there was no system tracking his location. At the same time, attention on the mountain was divided when two less experienced climbers from the same loose group went missing elsewhere on the route and were later found alive but suffering from frostbite. Because of this, Sharp's absence did not immediately raise concern. Climbers who had traveled with him, including George DiMarescu, only realized something was wrong when he failed to return later that night on May 15th, and no one could confirm seeing him descend. Even then, the delay seemed plausible. Sharp had previously turned back when conditions worsened, and it was assumed he had sheltered at a higher camp or bivouacked on the route, an extreme but sometimes used option at that altitude. It was not until the following morning that Sharp's condition became clear. Around 7 a.m., a Turkish team of 3 experienced climbers ascending toward the summit encountered him inside Green Boots Cave. They found him conscious but severely impaired, disoriented, slurring his words, and unable to coordinate basic movements. According to their accounts, Sharp raised a hand to acknowledge them and gestured for the team to continue upward rather than stop. While he was responsive enough to signal basic intent, his condition reflected advanced hypothermia and altitude sickness, limiting his ability to accurately assess the danger he was in. By the time word began spreading through the route that a climber was incapacitated in the cave, Sharp had already spent the night at 27,890 feet. With no communication, no support team, and no way to initiate a coordinated response, the window for effective intervention had already narrowed to almost nothing. The Turkish team faced a critical decision common in death zone encounters: attempt a rescue that would likely fail while risking their own lives and those of their Sherpa support team, or continue their climb and hope other teams with better resources might help Sharp later. Team leader Serhan Pokan later described the impossible nature of the choice, explaining that rescue attempts at that altitude required specific equipment, additional manpower, and weather conditions that were not available that morning. The team made the difficult decision to continue their ascent while notifying other climbers by radio about Sharp's location and condition. As the morning progressed, multiple other climbing teams discovered Sharp in increasingly deteriorated condition. Dawa Sherpa, a high-altitude worker with extensive rescue experience and superior altitude tolerance, spent approximately 30 minutes attempting to get Sharp to stand and begin descending under his own power. Sherpa's rescue technique involved providing physical support while encouraging Sharp to activate his remaining muscle function, but Sharp could not maintain balance or coordinate the complex movements necessary for safe descent on steep terrain. Despite the Sherpa's attempts to assist, Sharp was unable to stand, bear weight, or perform the basic movements required to clip into fixed lines or climb independently. Observers noted minimal leg response and severely impaired upper body coordination, consistent with advanced hypothermia, extreme altitude exposure, and exhaustion. With no capacity for self-movement and no equipment or manpower available to lower or stabilize him at that elevation, the Sherpa withdrew from the location and continued the descent. Around 9:30 a.m., another climber reached the cave. Maxim Chaya, a Lebanese climber with medical training and experience treating the altitude illness. Chaya remained with Sharp for close to an hour, attempting more extensive aid and assessing his condition using observable signs rather than equipment. Based on Sharp's confusion, slurred and largely unintelligible speech, and complete loss of leg function, Chaya identified advanced hypothermia, likely with a core temperature below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and determined that Sharp lacked the coordination or strength required to descend. Chaya described Sharp's condition in plain clinical terms. Frostbite had turned parts of his hands and forearms black, a sign that the tissue was already dead after prolonged exposure to extreme cold and poor circulation. His eyes were open and occasionally followed movement, but his replies were slow, confused, and often didn't match the questions, clear signs that lack of oxygen and severe cold were affecting his brain. Based on those signs, Chaya concluded that Sharp's hypothermia had progressed beyond what could be. Recovery would have required immediate descent to lower altitude and active warming, resources that simply didn't exist at that height. With no ability to move, no way to generate body heat, and extensive frostbite already present, any attempt to evacuate him would likely have caused cardiac arrest or another fatal collapse before reaching safety. As the situation unfolded, Russell Bryce, an expedition leader coordinating several teams by radio, began receiving steady overlapping reports from climbers moving through the area. The details did not change. Sharp was alive but unable to stand, unable to clip into fixed lines, and incapable of assisting in his own descent. From experience, Bryce understood what that meant in practical terms. At nearly 28,000 feet, a rescue would require several climbers to stop for extended periods in the death zone, abandon their summit bids, and attempt to move a fully incapacitated adult without supplemental oxygen, shelter, or any hauling system. In those conditions, the odds were not just poor, they were lethal for everyone involved. His assessment was blunt. Continued rescue attempts would not change the outcome and would likely add more deaths to the mountain. Radio traffic throughout the morning confirmed the scale of the dilemma. Climbers described trying to speak with Sharp, reposition him, and determine whether he could move even a few steps. Each report ended the same way: no leg function, delayed or incoherent responses, and visible deterioration. As time passed, weather updates from base camp warned that winds would increase later in the day, tightening an already narrow window for safe descent. In the death zone, even brief stops accelerate physical collapse. Techniques that might work lower on the mountain, rewarming, carrying, or lowering a climber, were impossible without equipment and rested manpower that simply did not exist on the route that day. This is why so many climbers continued past him. Over the course of the day, an estimated 40 climbers passed through Green Boots Cave, some on the way up, others trying to get down. Many assumed Sharp was already dead, based on his condition and lack of response. Others were told that help had been attempted and failed. Several were themselves close to exhaustion, low on oxygen, or racing against daylight to avoid becoming stranded higher on the mountain. At that altitude, stopping does not create safety. It often guarantees another emergency. Sharp spent his final hours alone inside the cave as climbers continued to funnel through the narrow passage above him. Severe hypothermia, altitude sickness, and exhaustion had rendered him completely immobile in the death zone, an environment where the body cannot stabilize, recover, or reverse decline without rapid descent. With no ability to move or generate heat, his condition continued to deteriorate as the day passed and temperatures dropped. Several days later, descending climbers encountered him in the same seated position, now unresponsive and clearly deceased. He remained beside the earlier remains of Tsewang Paljor, reinforcing the cave's role not as shelter, but as a fixed reference point on the route, one that climbers passed rather than stopped at. Due to altitude, weather, and risk to other climbers, no recovery attempt was made, and Sharp's body was left where he died. In the weeks that followed, expedition leaders, journalists, and mountaineering organizations reconstructed his final timeline using radio logs, witness accounts, weather data, and camp departure records. The analysis confirmed that once Sharp lost the ability to descend under his own power, survival was no longer realistic. His death became one of the most closely examined fatalities on Everest, frequently cited in discussions about rescue limits, summit pressure, and the ethics of high-altitude climbing. Over time, Sharp's body became part of the mountain's grim geography, occasionally referenced by climbers navigating the northeast ridge. His death did not result in a single clear verdict of blame, but it permanently altered how Everest deaths were discussed, shifting the focus from moral judgment to the hard limits of human capability at extreme altitude, where passing by can be the difference between one death and many. Sharp's death sparked intense debate within the mountaineering community over what climbers owe each other at extreme altitude. Critics argued that greater risks should have been taken to attempt a rescue, while others pointed out that in the death zone, failed rescues often create more fatalities without changing the outcome. Expedition leaders largely supported the decisions made on scene, stressing that rescue must be guided by realistic chances of success, not moral impulse alone. The tragedy exposed a deeper divide between individual responsibility and collective aid on Everest. It prompted renewed scrutiny of rescue protocols and equipment, but later, reviews reached the same conclusion. Given Sharp's condition and the limits of the death zone, no available intervention could have changed the result. Sharp's death led to lasting changes in how Everest expeditions are planned and managed. Commercial teams tightened turnaround times, strengthened client screening, and expanded emergency equipment and communication standards to reduce death zone risks. The incident also intensified debate over Everest's commercialization, highlighting the tension between traditional, self-reliant climbing styles and modern safety systems designed to limit exposure. His family publicly acknowledged his choices and urged that blame not be placed on other climbers facing impossible decisions at extreme altitude, a statement that eased some controversy, even as debate continued. Today, his body remains in Green Boots Cave, a stark reminder that on Everest, preparation and ambition are always secondary to the mountain's limits. It was June 18, 2016, on the Matterhorn's Hearnley Ridge, lower scramble section, at 11,900 feet elevation. The morning was clear with light winds, and the rock was still damp from overnight condensation. Guided parties had already begun their ascents, moving steadily up the technical sections of the route. Rhys Fairbank was 26 years old, a marketing coordinator from Manchester, England. He was traveling through Europe on a 3-week vacation with 2 friends, none of whom had mountaineering experience. Rhys was athletic in a casual sense. He played recreational soccer and went to the gym occasionally, but had no technical climbing background. He had seen photos of the Matterhorn and decided on impulse that he wanted to reach the summit. His friends were not interested, so he planned to go alone. He did not hire a guide, believing the route was a challenging hike rather than a technical climb. He rented basic gear, boots, a helmet, and a harness, but had no instruction on how to use them. His goal was to get as high as possible and take photos. He told his friends he'd be back by evening. The Hearnley Ridge, while considered the easiest route on the Matterhorn, is not a hike. It is a technical scramble requiring constant use of hands, route-finding skills, and comfort with extreme exposure. Sections of the route involve climbing on loose rock with drops of several thousand feet on either side. Fixed ropes are present in some areas, but they require proper use of a harness, carabiners, and knowledge of self-belay techniques. The rock is often damp from overnight condensation or melting snow, even in summer, and holds can break without warning. Falls on the lower ridge are often fatal due to the length of the fall and the terrain below, steep rock faces and scree slopes. Climbers without experience frequently misjudge the difficulty, and many turn back within the first few hours. Those who continue without proper skills are at extreme risk. Rhys left the mountain hut in the early morning, later than most guided parties. He carried a small backpack with water, snacks, and a camera. He wore the rented boots and helmet, but left the harness in his pack, unsure how to put it on. The first section of the route was straightforward, a steep trail over scree and boulders. Within an hour, the terrain steepened, and he began using his hands to pull himself up. He passed several guided groups who glanced at him but said nothing. Later, he reached a section where fixed ropes were anchored into the rock. He watched other climbers clip in with carabiners and tried to mimic them, but he had no carabiners of his own. He continued without clipping in, holding the rope with his hands for balance. The exposure increased. Sheer drops opened up on his right side. He moved slowly, testing each foothold. His hands were sweating, and his legs began to shake. At roughly 11,900 feet, he reached a section where the rock was smooth and angled steeply. There were no fixed ropes here, just small edges and cracks for hands and feet. He hesitated, looking for an easier way, but the route funneled through this section. He committed to the move. Rhys placed his left foot on a small ledge and reached up with his right hand to a crack in the rock. He pulled himself up, shifting his weight onto his left leg. His boot sole slipped. The rock was damp from overnight condensation, and the rubber lost friction. His left foot shot out from under him. His right hand was still in the crack, and he held on, but his body swung outward, away from the wall. His left hand scrambled for a hold and found nothing. His right hand, bearing his full body weight, began to slip from the crack. He tried to pull himself back in, but his grip failed. He fell backward, away from the rock face. A guided group, roughly 100 feet below, saw him fall. He dropped before striking a sloped rock ledge. His body tumbled and continued falling, bouncing off rock outcrops and sliding down a steep scree chute. He fell an estimated total of 300 feet before coming to rest on a narrow ledge. The guide from the group below immediately radioed for help and began climbing toward Rhys's location. It took roughly 20 minutes to reach him. Rhys was lying on his back, motionless. His helmet was still on but cracked. There was visible trauma to his head, chest, and limbs. No pulse was detected. The guide confirmed death at the scene and waited with the body until a rescue team arrived. A helicopter reached the site by late morning and recovered Rhys's body. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries sustained in a fall, including severe head trauma, spinal fractures, and internal bleeding. Contributing factors included lack of technical climbing experience, absence of proper safety equipment, and failure to use available fixed ropes and protection. Rhys had no training in the skills required for the route and had significantly underestimated the difficulty and risk. His friends were notified that afternoon. His body was released to his family several days later and returned to the United Kingdom. It was August 23, 2019, on the Hearnley ridge of the Matterhorn, at about 13,500 feet, just below the shoulder that leads into the summit pyramid. The Morrison family, 8 climbers moving in 2 loose groups, was approaching the final technical stretch of the route. The morning had started in their favor. Visibility reached more than 30 miles. Winds from the southwest held between 8 and 12 miles per hour. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the limestone ridge was dry under thin, filtered sunlight. The Hearnley ridge is built around steady movement and spacing. Climbers follow sections of solid rock broken by fixed steel cables drilled into the limestone. In places, the ridge narrows to less than 3 feet wide, with more than 3,000 feet of open air on either side. Progress depends on balance, clipped anchors, and careful foot placement. In late August, however, afternoon storms are common. Warm air rises from the valleys. Clouds build quickly, and exposed peaks begin to collect electrical charge when instability increases. Leading the group was Robert Morrison, 42, a real estate developer from Phoenix. With him were his wife Sandra, their twin sons Marcus and David, Robert's sister Elaine, and her husband Mark, and Mark's 2 adult children. None of the 8 had deep alpine experience beyond guided climbs of Mount Whitney and Mount Rainier. 2 local guides were assigned to the group, one ahead, one behind, to help manage spacing and cable transitions along the narrow sections. Robert carried a standard aluminum ice axe, steel crampons, trekking poles strapped to his pack, and a lightweight harness he clipped to fixed lines where required. A smartphone was mounted to his chest for filming. The goal was summit photos and family footage from the ridge. Weather had been discussed at the hut that morning, but there was no detailed briefing on lightning response beyond general awareness. The Matterhorn rises more than 4,000 feet above the surrounding terrain and often acts as a conductor when storm systems develop. As cloud base is lower and the difference in charge between sky and rock increases, static builds along ridgelines and metal fixtures. Fixed cables can begin to vibrate. Metal tools may produce a faint hum. In some cases, a small blue glow can appear at sharp metal points. The standard response in those moments is immediate descent. Earlier that week, 2 brief buildups had passed without incident. At 11:42 a.m., wind direction shifted from southwest to southeast. The change was slight but noticeable. Over the next half hour, clouds thickened over the Italian side of the peak. The ridge was still climbable. Nothing had failed, but the system was no longer steady. Their gear reflected a relaxed approach to a technical ridge. Robert carried a small mountaineering pack, a lightweight aluminum ice axe, and steel crampons they had purchased only weeks before the trip. Several members clipped inconsistently to fixed cables despite all wearing harnesses. In a short video recorded the night before, Sandra commented that most of the equipment felt excessive for what she described as just climbing some rocks. The Matterhorn is not built like a stable staircase. Its upper structure is mostly limestone, layered over older schist. The boundary between those rock types creates natural fracture lines. Stone loosens over time from freeze-thaw cycles, thermal expansion, and constant gravitational stress. The mountain's sharp pyramid shape is the result of that long erosion process. Steep faces and narrow ridges leave little space for climbers to step aside if debris begins to fall. Rockfall on the Hearnley ridge follows predictable daily patterns. Overnight, cold locks loose stones in place as water inside cracks freezes. After sunrise, warming temperatures expand the rock and weaken those bonds. By late morning, stones that held overnight can begin to shift. The most active period for natural rockfall is usually between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. when solar heating is strongest. Guides plan summit pushes early to move through exposed sections before warming increases the risk. Several parts of the ridge are known for loose rock collecting on ledges and in shallow gullies above the route. In those areas, climbers are expected to move carefully and avoid sudden movements that could dislodge debris onto teams below. Early warning signs include small pebbles sliding past boots, short bursts of dust drifting upward from impacts, and sharp metallic sounds when stone strikes fixed cables or anchors. That morning, the mountain showed no unusual signs. Wind remained light. There was no seismic activity. Temperatures followed normal late summer patterns. Still, guides had noted slightly increased rock movement in the previous 3 days, after a brief period of rain followed by clear, warmer weather. Conditions that can accelerate loosening. The Morrison family left the Hearnley hut at 4:45 a.m. following the standard pre-dawn departure used to reduce exposure to afternoon rockfall. Their pace through the first 1,000 vertical feet was steady, reaching that gain in about 90 minutes. The lower section of the route follows stable rock features with few objective hazards beyond footing and spacing. At that point, nothing appeared out of order. At approximately 7:30 a.m., the family reached the first true technical section of the Hearnley Ridge, where the route shifts from steep hiking into sustained climbing. Fixed steel cables began appearing along the rock. From this point forward, the ridge narrowed and exposure opened on both sides. A slip no longer meant a stumble. It meant a fall of thousands of feet. Movement required steady spacing, secure hand placement, and efficient progress. Robert paused frequently to record photos and video. Family members were asked to stop, reposition, and repeat movements for better framing. Instead of moving through the section quickly, they lingered in exposed areas to capture wider angles and stronger reactions. The rhythm of safe progression slowed. Near a cluster of bronze memorial plaques set into the rock, markers honoring climbers who had died on previous attempts, the group gathered for another recording. Sandra read several names aloud in an exaggerated voice, while the others reacted for the camera. The twins stood directly on the metal plaques during the filming, using them as a part of the shot. Their tone was casual, but the setting was not. Robert commented that the plaques were reminders not to make the same mistakes, while panning across engraved dates from past accidents. Sandra added that better equipment made a difference, gesturing toward their own gear. The exchange was recorded as light content, but it showed a gap between the seriousness of the place and how they were treating it. As they climbed higher, the behavior escalated. The guides were positioned ahead and behind and temporarily out of line of sight. Along a section where loose stones rested on ledges above the route, Marcus nudged a small rock with his boot and watched it fall. David followed, pushing another stone free. The sound of rock striking rock echoed down the face. Robert filmed from a few feet away. What began as small debris turned into larger pieces being dislodged intentionally. Deliberately causing a rockfall violates a basic rule of alpine climbing. Stones can accelerate quickly and travel thousands of feet, striking climbers below who may not see them coming. Even small rocks can carry enough force to cause serious injury. The family did not check for other parties beneath them before continuing. By 9:15 a.m., they reached a narrower section of ridge where careful hand and foot placement became essential. Exposure extended more than 3,000 feet down the north face and nearly 4,000 feet down the east face. At this point, climbers typically shorten pauses and focus on secure movement. Instead, the group slowed again for photos. Sandra stood near the ridge crest with her arms extended for dramatic effect, while Robert adjusted angles. The twins took turns posing close to the edge. During one recording, Marcus loosened his grip briefly and pretended to slip while David filmed. The moment was controlled, but it introduced unnecessary movement on unstable rock. The ridge remained stable. The weather still held, but spacing had tightened. Loose debris had already been disturbed, and focus had shifted away from controlled movement. The system had not failed. It was being tested. Their casual attitude continued as the conditions around them began to change. The air temperature climbed from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 34 degrees Fahrenheit as the sun warmed the upper ridge. Overnight freezing had held many loose stones in place, but with the rise in temperature, that bond weakened. Small pebbles began skipping down the rock faces above the route. The sound was light but steady. Sharp clicks and brief rattles that experienced climbers recognized as early rockfall warning. Robert noticed the movement but treated it as background activity rather than a hazard. He filmed the stones bouncing past their position, keeping the group in place longer than necessary. Instead of moving quickly through the exposed section, they lingered. Sandra and the others stayed clustered on a narrow stretch of ridge where most climbers normally pass without stopping. Their pace slowed. What should have been a steady push upward became repeated pauses for filming and repositioning. Every stop extended their exposure beneath loose terrain. The Hearnley Ridge is designed for flow. Short rests, controlled spacing, constant movement. Remaining stationary under warming rock increases risk with each passing minute. By 10:30 a.m., heating intensified across the upper face. Climbers higher on the ridge reported hearing larger stones breaking free in adjacent gullies. The sound changed from isolated clicks to a more constant backdrop of impacts echoing against the limestone. Rockfall activity was no longer occasional. It was spreading across multiple sections of the route. The Morrison family moved toward the louder areas, believing the terrain looked more dramatic for photos. Instead of following the established track, worn smooth by decades of careful route selection, they drifted toward looser ground where broken rock had collected in shallow pockets. Marcus pointed out a large boulder resting on a narrow ledge, roughly 40 feet above the main climbing line. It was roughly 5 feet high and estimated to weigh between 2 and 3 tons. The rock sat slightly tilted, its base resting on fractured limestone. Freeze-thaw cycles over many seasons had widened small cracks beneath it. Morning heat caused subtle expansion in the stone and the ledge below, reducing the friction that held it in place. The balance was already marginal. The added weight of climbers moving near its base would introduce new load into a system that was no longer stable. Robert and Sandra climbed up beside the large boulder and began taking photos that required them to lean their full weight against it. They braced their boots on the narrow ledge and pushed as if trying to make the rock move. Marcus stood a few feet away, filming on his phone while urging them to push harder. The stone sat on a slanted shelf of limestone that already showed small gaps beneath its base. The posing continued for nearly 20 minutes. Family members rotated in and out, pressing their shoulders and hands against the rock. At one point, David noticed that pushing on one side produced a faint grinding sound and a slight shift, no more than a fraction of an inch. Instead of stepping back, he called the others over to feel it move. The grinding grew clearer as more force was applied. Sandra began pushing in short, repeated bursts to recreate the sound, while Robert recorded. Each shove added pressure to contact points that were already limited. The rock rested on uneven edges, supported by friction and balance rather than deep anchoring. With every push and release cycle, small grains of limestone broke free. Tiny voids widened between the boulder and the ledge. The movement remained subtle, but the resistance was weakening. By approximately 11:45 a.m., the combined effects of warming rock, gravity, and repeated loading shifted the stone's center of mass. The support zone beneath it had narrowed. Marcus was now standing directly behind the boulder, camera raised, as Sandra leaned into it with her full weight. When the ledge edge finally gave way, the rock tilted outward. Its base lost contact and the several-ton mass rolled forward, dropping toward the main climbing route, roughly 40 feet below. The boulder's first movement was subtle. It shifted less than an inch at its base as weight transferred across the fractured contact points beneath it. The stone had been resting on 2 primary support edges and a smaller rear wedge of broken limestone. Repeated loading had already reduced friction along those contact surfaces. When Sandra stepped back and her boot displaced a small supporting fragment, the rear wedge fractured. The mass began to tilt outward. At first, the rotation was slow, measured, almost controlled. The boulder weighed several tons and stood roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide at its base. As it pivoted, the lower contact edge crumbled, and the center of gravity moved beyond the remaining support line. For roughly 2 seconds, the stone rotated, no more than 15 degrees. During that brief window, it was still technically recoverable if the mass had settled back. But the friction holding it in place had already failed, and gravity took over. Sandra recognized the movement and tried to shift laterally along the ledge. The space available was less than 2 feet wide, bordered by open air on one side and fractured rock on the other. There was no anchor line between her and the drop. As the boulder continued its rotation, its lower edge swept across the surface where she had been standing. When it struck her torso, the force was concentrated along the midsection. The force was sufficient to collapse the ribcage on impact. Her ribcage collapsed instantly under compression. The impact carried her off the ledge and onto the exposed face below. Marcus stood slightly behind the boulder's original position. When the stone's lower edge hit the lip of the ledge during rotation, the impact transferred force into the surrounding limestone. The rock fractured along existing fault lines. Large pieces sheared off. One fragment, approximately 2 feet across and weighing several hundred pounds, broke free and struck Marcus across the head and upper chest. The blow knocked him backward and over the edge. The fragment continued downslope, breaking apart on impact with lower rock. The main boulder, now fully committed to descent, struck a protruding outcrop roughly 8 feet below its original position. The collision split the stone along internal fissures. Half of the mass continued as a primary block, the remainder fragmented into multiple pieces, ranging from fist-sized debris to slabs weighing more than 200 pounds. The bouncing motion converted rotational movement into forward acceleration. Within seconds, the main mass reached an estimated speed of approximately 50 to 60 miles per hour as it moved down the fall line. Below the ledge, Robert and David had stopped on the primary climbing line, positioned roughly 20 feet downslope. The route there narrowed to less than 3 feet across, bordered by a near vertical drop. When the first fragments passed them, they had less than 2 seconds of warning. There was no lateral escape route. The fixed cable at that section was anchored against the rock face, offering no shelter from falling debris. If you want more mountain case studies grounded in real terrain, real mechanics, and real decision chains, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. The primary block struck Robert directly across the upper torso. The impact produced catastrophic blunt force trauma, collapsing the chest cavity and forcing him backward against the rock wall before he was carried off the route. David was hit first by fast-moving fragments and then by Sandra's falling body, which had already accelerated over more than 20 vertical feet. The combined force caused a fatal cervical spine fracture and severe head trauma. Both were pushed from the ledge within seconds of one another. From first movement to final impact, the sequence lasted approximately 12 seconds. The main boulder continued another 300 vertical feet, striking protruding shelves and breaking apart into a wide debris field. The largest remaining section came to rest against a slanted limestone bench, roughly 280 feet below the original ledge. Smaller fragments spread outward across a fan-shaped area nearly 60 feet wide. Helmets, gloves, a broken trekking pole, and 2 phones were scattered among the rock. Climbers positioned about 200 feet above the fall line initially registered the sound as routine morning rockfall. It was only when dusk cleared that they saw equipment lying across the route and multiple bodies, motionless, on separate shelves. Robert's body was located on a narrow ledge, approximately 240 feet below the original position. He had come to rest on his knees with his upper body folded forward over the rock slope, helmet partially crushed beneath him. The position appeared almost bowed, but it was the result of gravity and the angle of the incline. His harness remained intact, though unclipped from any fixed line. Sandra was found roughly 30 feet downslope from Robert, positioned against a shallow depression in the rock where debris had collected. The fall and impact had caused extensive blunt force injuries. Her ice axe lay several feet away, embedded in loose fragments. Marcus had fallen farther, coming to rest near the edge of the debris field, approximately 310 feet below the original ledge. He was located adjacent to one of the larger fractured stone pieces that had broken from the main mass. His helmet had separated during impact and was found higher up the slope. David's body was recovered on a lower rock shelf, about 20 feet from Marcus, partially shielded by accumulated debris. The distribution pattern matched the sequence of impacts reconstructed later by investigators. None of the 4 showed any signs of movement after initial impact. Radio contact with Zermatt Rescue Coordination was established at approximately 12:15 p.m. The first report described multiple climbers struck by falling rock with no visible movement. A helicopter launched within 45 minutes, once wind conditions stabilized. Aerial assessment confirmed the severity of injuries before any personnel were lowered. Based on visible trauma and positioning, the mission shifted from rescue to recovery before ground contact. Recovery operations required 2 full days due to terrain instability. The debris field remained active. Small stones continued to fall intermittently as sunlight warmed the fractured limestone. Long-line helicopter techniques were used to lower rescue technicians one at a time onto each shelf. Each position required anchor assessment before any movement. The bodies were secured individually in recovery bags and lifted vertically to avoid dislodging additional rock. Larger fragments were left in place unless they posed a direct hazard to other climbers moving through the route. The 4 surviving family members, Sandra's sister Elaine, her husband Mark, and Mark's 2 adult children, were located higher on the ridge at the time of the collapse. They had not been in the immediate fall line, but witnessed the event from less than 40 feet away. None sustained physical injuries. However, they were unable to descend immediately due to shock and the temporary closure of the route while rescue coordination began. Guides secured them to fixed anchors and stabilized their positions until clearance was given to move. They were escorted down in stages under supervision of mountain guides and rescue personnel. The descent took several hours due to congestion and safety spacing requirements. Once at Hearnley Hut, they were evaluated for minor abrasions and dehydration, but required no advanced medical intervention. They were transported to Zermatt later that evening for formal statements as part of the accident investigation. The ridge reopened only after debris stabilization and safety reassessment were completed. The 4 survivors returned to the valley, physically unharmed. The mountain environment remained unchanged. The consequences of the collapse were limited to the debris field, the equipment scattered across the slope, and the absence of 4 climbers who had been standing there minutes earlier. Investigators found cameras, phones, and mounting equipment scattered across the debris field. Several devices were still intact. The recovered footage provided a clear timeline of events in the minutes before the collapse. Video showed repeated interaction with a large, unstable rock near the memorial site. The recordings confirmed that the group remained in close proximity to the boulder while applying force to it, despite visible movement and shifting debris around its base. The official report issued by Swiss authorities confirmed that 4 members of the Morrison family died from blunt force trauma caused by direct boulder impact and secondary rockfall. Forensic findings documented injuries consistent with multi-ton stone impact, including severe chest compression, skull fractures, cervical spine disruption, and catastrophic blunt force trauma consistent with high-mass rock impact. Video recovered from personal devices confirmed that the boulder had been subjected to repeated pushing and loading in the minutes leading up to its release. Geological assessment determined that the rock had been resting in a position of marginal stability, supported by limited contact points against fractured limestone. Freeze-thaw cycles and seasonal erosion had already reduced its structural support. Investigators concluded that the additional force applied by the group accelerated the failure by shifting the rock's center of gravity beyond its balance point. Experienced climbers typically avoid contact with loose rock in exposed terrain and move quickly through unstable sections to limit exposure time. After the incident, the Hearnley Ridge was temporarily closed while mountain rescue teams and local guides inspected adjacent rock bands for additional instability. Several loose blocks near the memorial site were removed or stabilized, and spacing protocols were reinforced for guided groups moving through that section. Updated advisories now emphasize strict non-interference with unstable rock and immediate reporting of any shifting stone along the route. The investigation confirmed that the collapse was not spontaneous. The boulder had been resting in marginal balance, supported by limited contact points already weakened by seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. Added force shifted its center of gravity beyond its support line. Once that threshold was crossed, gravity dictated the rest. 4 climbers were positioned directly in the fall line when the mass released. They had treated the ridge as something to play with. The ridge responded according to physics. It was July 14th, 2016, on the Matterhorn, along the Swiss-Italian border at 14,692 feet elevation. The Hearnley Ridge Road had been shedding rock faster than usual that summer, and the mountain was showing signs of instability. Temperatures had been unusually warm for days, destabilizing frozen rock and increasing the frequency of debris falling from the upper faces. Nolan Keer was 41 years old, a civil engineer from Portland, Oregon. He had been climbing for 18 years with over 30 alpine summits across 3 continents. His colleagues knew him as methodical and safety conscious, someone who turned back when conditions weren't right. He had attempted the Matterhorn twice before, both times retreating due to weather. This was his 3rd attempt, planned during a 2-week vacation. He climbed solo by preference and aimed to summit via the Hearnley Ridge and descend the same day. The Hearnley Ridge is a 4,000-foot scramble of loose rock, fixed ropes, and exposed ridgelines. July 2016 had been unusually warm across the Alps, with temperatures reaching the mid-70s degrees Fahrenheit at lower elevations. The heat accelerated snowmelt and destabilized rock that had been frozen in place for months. Rockfall on the Matterhorn is constant, but warming conditions increase frequency and size. Rocks dislodged higher on the mountain can reach speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour by the time they reach lower sections. The descent is statistically more dangerous. Climbers are fatigued, and loose rock is more easily triggered when facing downward. The Mountain Hut staff mentioned that several guided parties had reported increased rockfall that week, particularly in the afternoon. Posted signs at the trailhead warned climbers to start early and descend before noon. Nolan left the hut at 4:30 a.m., headlamp cutting through the dark. He made good time on the ascent. Reaching the summit by mid-morning, he spent 10 minutes at the top before beginning his descent. By late morning, the sun was fully on the east face, and distant cracks and rumbles echoed from above. He passed 2 guided groups moving slowly upward. Nolan continued down, moving carefully through a section of steep, broken rock. Nolan was descending a narrow section of the ridge where the route funnels climbers through a natural choke point. He was below a fixed rope section, facing into the rock, testing each handhold. A guided party of 3 climbers was roughly 200 feet below him, taking a water break. One of the clients looked up and saw movement high on the face, a dark mass separating from the ridgeline several hundred feet above Nolan. He shouted, but the wind and distance made it inaudible. The rockfall was a cascade of fractured stone, some pieces the size of basketballs, others larger. A deep, rolling thunder grew louder as it approached. The first wave of debris struck the ridge above him, shattering on impact and sending fragments in every direction. A large piece struck him directly in the upper back and right shoulder. The force threw him forward and off balance. His left hand lost its grip. He twisted sideways, and a second rock hit the side of his helmet, snapping his head violently to the left. He fell backward, away from the rock face. His body tumbled down a steep scree slope before striking a rock outcrop. The guided party below saw him fall and immediately radioed for help. The guide anchored his clients and climbed toward Nolan, reaching him within minutes. Nolan was unresponsive, lying on his side. His helmet was cracked through, and there was visible trauma to his head and torso. No pulse was detected. The guide stayed with the body, while his clients descended to alert additional teams. A rescue team reached the site by early afternoon, but recovery was delayed until the following morning due to continued rockfall risk and deteriorating weather. Nolan's body was transported down by helicopter the next day. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with catastrophic injuries consistent with high-velocity impact and a subsequent fall. His gear was intact and properly used. No errors in technique or judgment were identified. His family was notified within 36 hours, and his body was returned to the United States the following week. The incident was recorded in alpine safety logs as a rockfall fatality during descent. It was April 22nd, 2016, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet was filling with the organized chaos of another spring climbing season. 15 commercial expeditions occupied the tent city sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier. Brightly colored shelters clustered by company on fractured ice that groaned beneath the weight of human ambition. Prayer flags snapped in gusts carrying juniper smoke from morning pujas and the metallic edge of glacial air. Morning temperatures sat near 15 degrees Fahrenheit, climbing into the low 30s by midday as climbers moved between mess tents, reviewing forecasts and checking acclimatization schedules. Among those preparing for the first summit window were Jake and Megan Aldrich, both 33 years old, from Boulder, Colorado. They were difficult to miss. Jake stood 6'2" and carried the dense build of a former collegiate wrestler at the University of Wyoming, where he had competed at 197 pounds before transitioning into personal training. Megan was 5'10" with the broad shoulders of a former Division I volleyball player at Colorado State, now the owner of a CrossFit-affiliated gym in Boulder. In a camp full of fit people, the two of them looked like they had been carved from different stone, heavier, more muscular, visibly powerful in a way that drew attention, and from those who understood altitude physiology, quiet concern. They had been legally married at a courthouse in Boulder 4 months before departing for Nepal. The expedition was never about paperwork. It was about the moment, a symbolic ceremony on the summit, captured on camera and shared with the roughly 40,000 people who followed their combined social media accounts. They had built the narrative over 18 months, the engagement on Kilimanjaro, the training montages, the gear reveals, the countdown posts. A small adventure apparel company had sponsored part of the $130,000 combined expedition cost in exchange for branded summit content. Their families knew, their followers knew. The commitment was public and impossible to walk away from without explanation. Their mountaineering experience was genuine, but limited. Kilimanjaro 2 years earlier, Mount Rainier the following summer, and Aconcagua 6 months before Everest, the highest topping out at 22,841 feet. Solid for recreational mountaineering, insufficient for an 8,000-meter peak where the margin between survival and death compressed with every 1,000 feet. The mid-tier operator they chose required liability waivers, proof of insurance, and full payment. Beyond that, vetting was minimal. They carried ceremony items in a small dry bag, 2 wedding rings strung on a braided cord designed to drape around necks rather than be placed on fingers buried inside expedition mitts at -30 degrees. A compact fabric banner displayed their wedding date. A small camera with a folding tripod completed the kit. Less than 2 pounds combined. To Jake, negligible. To anyone who understood what those items demanded above 26,000 feet, the weight was not the problem. The time was. Their assigned guide was Kancha Gyalpo, 41 years old, from Tame Village in the Khumbu region. Kancha had summited Everest 15 times across 19 years of guiding. That began when he was 22 and still carried loads for companies paying by the trip. The years had weathered him, deep lines around his eyes, a stillness suggesting energy was something conserved rather than displayed, and a quietness clients sometimes mistook for passivity. It was not. It was the patience of a man who had watched enough poor decisions at altitude to know that arguing rarely changed outcomes and often accelerated them. His income supported a household under sustained pressure. His wife required ongoing treatment for a chronic kidney condition at a clinic in Kathmandu. Monthly visits, medication, periodic procedures that consumed money faster than altitude work replaced it. 2 daughters attended school in Namche Bazaar. The fees a fixed cost that could not be deferred. The $8,000 fee for guiding Jake and Megan was not optional income. It was structural. Kancha met the couple during gear organization on April 23rd. He noticed the banner first, bright fabric handled with more care than climbing hardware. When Jake explained the plan, Kancha listened, then asked how long they expected to spend on top. Jake said 15 to 20 minutes. Kancha explained that every minute on the summit was borrowed from the descent, and weather above 26,000 feet shifted faster than any forecast could track. Jake acknowledged the point, the way people acknowledge information they have already decided not to act on. An unnamed younger assistant Sherpa was assigned to support logistics and load carrying, handling equipment through rotations and the summit push, while Kancha carried the full weight of guiding decisions. The expedition briefing on April 25th was led by Colin Pratt, the American expedition leader, who outlined the route, acclimatization schedule, and the protocols that separated successful expeditions from fatal ones. Turnaround time was set at 1 p.m., regardless of position. The death zone above 26,000 feet was described clinically, the body deteriorating faster than it could recover, supplemental oxygen slowing decline, but not stopping it. Rescue above Camp 4 ranging from extremely difficult to impossible. Jake asked about pausing on the summit for the ceremony. Pratt advised keeping summit time to a minimum. Quick photos were standard, but extended stays increased exposure and consumed oxygen, critical for descent. Megan asked about carrying the banner above Camp 3. Kancha recommended against non-essential weight at those altitudes. Jake insisted the items were manageable. That evening, Kancha spoke privately with Pratt. The ceremony would add time on the summit that compounded every risk outlined in the briefing. The couple had no experience above 23,000 feet. Their physical builds, heavy, muscular frames, would demand more oxygen at altitude than leaner climbers, potentially accelerating fatigue and worsening acclimatization. He requested authorization for higher oxygen flow rates on the upper mountain. Pratt acknowledged every concern, approved the request, and noted that the couple had signed waivers and paid in full. Unless they demonstrated clear incapacity, the expedition would proceed. The first acclimatization rotation began April 28th through the Khumbu Icefall, nearly 2 miles of fractured glacier, winding through a maze of house-sized ice blocks, deep crevasses spanned by aluminum ladders, lashed together over open voids, and fixed ropes marking a route that shifted as the glacier moved beneath it. Teams departed before dawn to minimize exposure, while overnight cold kept the ice more stable, the sharp cracks of settling seracs echoing across the cirque in the pre-dawn darkness. Jake moved through the icefall with the kind of raw physical competence that altitude had not yet had time to erode. His steps were confident on the uneven ice, his balance steady on the ladder crossings where aluminum rungs flexed and swayed over open voids, his breathing controlled even on the steeper pitches. Megan was solid but worked noticeably harder, her breathing heavier on steep sections, her pace slightly slower through the technical passages where precise foot placement mattered most. Both stopped for photos at ladder crossings, adding perhaps 10 minutes to their total icefall time. Not dangerous in isolation, but a pattern Concha registered alongside everything else he was observing. At Camp 1, oxygen saturation showed Jake at 80% and Megan at 76%. Acceptable, but Megan at the lower margin. The kind of reading that meant nothing alone but gained significance if it repeated higher. The western CWM traverse to Camp 2 revealed the first real separation. The broad glacial valley stretched for miles between the walls of Nuptse and Lhotse, deceptively flat but riddled with hidden crevasses and punishing in its own way. Cold in the morning, then a heat trap as sunlight reflected off surrounding ice, pushing temperatures into the 40s and accelerating dehydration at 20,000 feet. Megan's pace dropped steadily. Rest breaks lengthened. The heat drained her faster than Jake, and by the time they reached Camp 2, the gap between their energy levels was visible to everyone on the team. Jake stayed close, encouraging. Their dynamic was genuine, supportive, loving, not toxic. Shared stubbornness, rooted in a dream they built together, which made them harder to dissuade than ego alone. At Camp 2, Megan's saturation read 73%. Concha recommended an extra rest day. Jake agreed immediately. He was protective of Megan in a way that was uncomplicated and real. They rested, hydrated, descended. Megan posted footage that evening, framing the rotation as preparation for the ceremony. Several thousand likes, dozens of comments about the wedding. The audience was invested. Walking away meant explaining a failure neither was prepared to accept. The second rotation began May 4th, and the Lhotse face exposed the full problem. The route climbed a wall of blue ice at angles between 40 and 50 degrees, the surface glinting under high-altitude sun where crampons had scarred it into a lattice of scratch marks. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained leg strength, cardiovascular endurance, and precise crampon technique that altitude degraded with every hour. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 5 hours. Jake managed 6. Megan required nearly 8. Her deterioration followed a pattern Concha recognized. She stopped every 25 to 30 feet, legs trembling, breathing rapid even during pauses. Crampon placement became imprecise, front points skating rather than biting, balance wobbling on traverses where a fall meant sliding hundreds of feet. Jake coached her through each section with steady patience, but coaching could not fix what was happening inside her lungs and blood. At Camp 3, 23,500 feet, Megan's saturation read 69%. Concha explained the trend. 76 at Camp 1, 73 at Camp 2, now 69. Each camp brought a steeper drop, and the pattern indicated her body was not adapting. He described cerebral and pulmonary edema, fluid in the brain or lungs, progressing from manageable to fatal within hours. He recommended she seriously consider whether a summit attempt was advisable. Jake responded immediately. She was having a difficult rotation, not a crisis. Supplemental oxygen would compensate. They had trained 18 months. Megan backed him. She would not be the reason they failed. The reason 40,000 people watched a wedding that never happened. Concha pushed harder. Trends mattered more than single readings. Supplemental oxygen assisted, but did not repair acclimatization failure. If her numbers continued declining, she would enter the death zone with a deficit willpower could not bridge. They listened. They did not change course. They descended. Megan recovered over the following week, but not the way strong acclimatizers recovered. The bounce back was slow, her energy muted, her appetite suppressed longer than normal. She spent most of her rest days in the tent rather than moving around camp, and the color had not fully returned to her face, even after a week at base camp. Concha noted all of it. The weather window arrived mid-May. Forecasts showed reduced winds and clear skies beginning May 19th, but meteorological models also tracked a front approaching from the west that could narrow the window depending on its speed and trajectory. Most teams planned to summit early on the 19th, to maximize their margin against the incoming system. The mountain would be crowded, but crowded and safe beat empty and trapped. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. Jake and Megan confirmed without hesitation. Concha made a final appeal to Jake the evening before departure. Megan's numbers had trended wrong at every altitude. The ceremony added time on the summit they could not afford if the front arrived early. Jake's response was not aggressive. It was final. They had come too far and committed too publicly. He was not asking Concha to agree. He was asking him to be there. They climbed through Camp 2 and Camp 3, reaching Camp 4 at 26,000 feet around 5:30 p.m. on May 18th. The South Col was barely habitable, a wind-swept plateau of shattered rock and ice exposed to constant wind that drove spindrift through tent seams and iced zippers shut. Temperatures sat well below zero even inside shelters, and the atmosphere was so thin that every task demanded twice the effort and half the coordination of sea level. Climbers moved like they were underwater, each action requiring conscious thought that should have been automatic. Concha checked saturation on supplemental oxygen. Jake, 68%. Megan, 64%. At sea level, 64 would prompt immediate hospitalization. At 26,000 feet on supplemental oxygen, it represented severe hypoxia and a body losing its fight against altitude faster than equipment could compensate. Concha delivered his most direct warning. Megan's numbers meant continuing higher carried significant risk of edema. The summit stood 3,000 feet above, and every foot would worsen her condition. If she deteriorated on the ridge, rescue was impossible. He asked them both to descend. Jake locked the situation. They were doing this together. If Megan descended, he descended. If he descended, the ceremony did not happen. All or nothing. Megan agreed. Pratt was consulted via radio from base camp. His information came through Concha's reports. He could not see Megan's condition firsthand. He recommended descent but deferred to waivers and client autonomy. Concha ran the oxygen math. At standard flow of 2 to 3 liters per minute, supply covered the push and descent with margin. But if Megan required maximum flow at 4 liters per minute, which her numbers demanded, and the ceremony added 20+ minutes at the highest point, the margin compressed to nothing. A slow descent would exhaust supply before Camp 4. He explained this. Jake said they would move fast enough. Concha knew they would not. When gear-up time arrived, the final warning appeared. Megan fumbled with layers, struggled to connect her oxygen mask, needed help with tasks that should have taken minutes. Preparation consumed nearly an hour longer than expected. Concha recognized cognitive impairment, the brain starving for oxygen, struggling with simple sequences. He said as much. Jake helped her finish and stated they were ready. Other teams departed between 10 and 11 p.m. Jake and Megan left at 12:15 a.m., 90 minutes behind, climbing through the upper mountain while others were already descending. The southeast ridge stretched above in darkness, the wind cutting across exposed terrain with a steadiness that numbed any skin left uncovered. Fixed ropes marked a line angling upward toward the balcony at 27,600 feet. Concha led, Jake behind, Megan behind Jake, the assistant behind Megan. For the first 2 hours, the pace was slow but sustainable. Supplemental oxygen softened the edge. Clear night, stars dense overhead, wind manageable, headlamp beams of teams above, visible as a scattered constellation moving up the ridge. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, everything changed. Megan's deterioration accelerated in the thinner air with a momentum that rest stops could not interrupt. She paused every 15 steps, then every 10, her breathing harsh and rapid, even through the oxygen mask. Her speech slowed when Jake checked on her, responses arriving late, words coming in fragments that required assembly rather than flowing naturally. She stumbled on the fixed rope twice, catching herself with reflexes that lagged behind the danger by margins that were shrinking each time. Jake transitioned from encouragement to physical intervention. He pulled her upward on steep sections, braced her weight when her legs failed. He became her second set of legs, burning his own reserves at a rate fitness could slow but not stop. Concha increased Megan's oxygen to maximum, 4 liters per minute, knowing every minute at that rate shortened the supply, meant to carry her down. Through the mid-morning hours on the upper ridge, the margin became visible in human form. Faster teams who summited at dawn descended past Jake and Megan, who were still grinding upward. Climbers heading down, healthy and on schedule, stepping aside while the couple pushed past in the wrong direction. Those teams would be below the balcony before conditions changed. Jake and Megan were hours from the summit and moving against the flow of everyone who had timed the window correctly. Kancha watched the sky, cloud building from the west, the front approaching, its leading edge a thickening band of gray, consuming the horizon. He told Jake. Jake acknowledged and kept climbing. They reached the summit at approximately 11:30 a.m. Megan did not walk the final steps. Jake held her upright, arm locked around her waist, her legs shuffling without resemblance to climbing. Getting her to 29,032 feet had not been an ascent. It had been an act of will imposed on a body, trying to stop for hours. Jake unfurled the banner. He draped the ring cord around Megan's neck, then his own. He propped the camera to capture them both against the sky, two people on the highest point on Earth with their wedding date between them. The moment was genuine. It was also happening to a woman whose eyes could not focus, whose body swayed in his grip, whose presence on that summit was maintained entirely by the man beside her. Kancha urged descent after 5 minutes. Megan's oxygen was burning at maximum flow. The supply would not survive a slow descent. The clouds were closer, the western horizon disappearing behind advancing gray. Jake said they needed a few more minutes. Kancha repeated the warning. Oxygen, weather, descent time compounding. Jake adjusted the camera and kept going. 20 minutes passed, then 25. They began descending at approximately 11:55 a.m. Megan collapsed almost immediately. She made it past the south summit before her legs stopped functioning. She sat down at roughly 28,700 feet and could not stand. Eyes open, but unfocused. Responses delayed by seconds that stretched longer each time. When Kancha asked her to lift her foot, she looked at him, as if the request had been made in a language she no longer understood. HACE had progressed past what supplemental oxygen could manage. Her bottles, drained by hours at maximum flow, were depleted. Jake and Kancha tried to move her. They lifted her by the arms, set her boots into the track, and attempted to walk her downward one step at a time. She managed a few steps before her weight sagged and her legs folded beneath her. They tried again and again. The same result each time. A few shuffling steps followed by collapse. Her body refusing commands her brain could no longer properly send. Minutes accumulated. 5, then 10, then 20. Each one representing distance, not covered on a descent that was already dangerously behind schedule. The storm arrived while they were still above 28,400 feet. It did not build gradually. Wind increased from gusts to sustained force within minutes, driving spindrift in horizontal sheets that erased visibility from hundreds of feet to nothing. Cloud cover overtook them and swallowed the ridge in gray that removed depth, direction, and every navigational reference on the upper mountain. Temperature plunged, -30, then colder with wind chill, enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes and turn the air itself into something that hurt to breathe. Kancha and the assistant attempted to move Megan, but she was dead weight in a harness on terrain that punished every unbalanced step. Two people could not lower an incapacitated adult down a steep, icy ridge in a whiteout without risking a fall that killed everyone on the rope. Jake tried to help, but was deteriorating. Movement slower, coordination degrading, speech fragmenting in ways that mirrored what had happened to Megan hours earlier. His oxygen was running critically low, reserves consumed by the extended summit stay, and the effort of hauling Megan up terrain she never should have been on. The couple became immobile around 28,400 feet. Kancha positioned them against the slope, clipped to the fixed line, sheltered as much as the ridge allowed. He attempted to direct Jake downward. One final time. Jake would not leave Megan. His arm was around her, and his body between her and the wind, and nothing was going to separate him from the person he had carried to the top of the world. Megan became non-responsive first. Her breathing grew irregular. Shallow efforts separated by pauses that lengthened until they stopped entirely. Cerebral edema, compounded by hypothermia and oxygen depletion, shut her body down in stages that Kancha could observe but not reverse. She died with Jake beside her, his arms still around her, the ring cord still hanging from both their necks beneath layers of ice-crusted fabric. Without supplemental oxygen at 28,400 feet in storm conditions, Jake's decline was rapid and irreversible. When Kancha made one final attempt to get him to stand, Jake's eyes were open, but empty of recognition, staring through Kancha rather than at him. His body had stopped shivering, which at that temperature meant his core had dropped past the point where the brain could mount a survival response. Kancha could see what was happening and knew that staying meant dying beside a man who was already gone. Kancha made the decision to descend with the assistant. They left the couple on the ridge and began moving downward, following the fixed rope by feel when visibility collapsed to arm's length, wind tearing from shifting directions, cold working into every gap in their layering with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. They descended approximately 800 vertical feet to the balcony at 27,600 feet, a flat area on the southeast ridge that Kancha had crossed 30 times and could locate by memory even when the mountain disappeared behind moving snow. They sheltered in a depression on the leeward side and survived the night. When conditions eased the following morning, Kancha and the assistant descended to Camp 4 and continued to base camp. Kancha had severe frostbite across both feet. The tissue damage from a night at 27,600 feet in storm conditions was irreversible. In surgery weeks later in Kathmandu, he lost several toes from both feet. The damage ended his guiding career permanently. He returned to Tame and found work managing a small trekking lodge, walking with a limp that worsened in cold weather. The assistant sustained frostbite to several fingers and did not return for high-altitude work. Jake and Megan Aldrich were spotted by climbers on subsequent summit pushes later in the season, together near the fixed line at 28,400 feet. Jake's arms still around Megan. The bodies remained on the mountain. Their final image, posted from Camp 4 before the summit push, showed them geared up and smiling, the banner visible, and the ring cord draped across their jackets. The post accumulated tens of thousands of shares, most from people who did not learn until later what it represented. The last moment before a weather window closed and a mountain collected what stubbornness had offered it. It was September 9th, 2017, on the Matterhorn's Hearnley Ridge at 12,800 feet elevation. The morning had started clear and calm, with temperatures in the low 40s degrees Fahrenheit. The route was busy with multiple guided parties making their way toward the summit. Kira Lindell was 29 years old, a personal trainer and yoga instructor from San Diego, California. She was in exceptional cardiovascular shape, teaching multiple classes per week and running ultramarathons. Friends described her as disciplined and health conscious, someone who believed fitness could overcome most physical challenges. She had no mountaineering experience, but had read extensively about the Matterhorn and watched dozens of summit videos online. She booked a guided climb, confident that her conditioning would compensate for her lack of technical skill. She arrived in Switzerland 2 days before the climb, spending one night at a low-elevation town and one night at the mountain hut at 10,700 feet. She felt strong and eager, dismissing mild dizziness as travel fatigue. Altitude sickness occurs when the body cannot adjust quickly enough to reduced oxygen levels at high elevation. Symptoms typically begin above 8,000 feet and worsen with rapid ascent. Acute mountain sickness includes headache, nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. If untreated or if ascent continues, can progress to high-altitude cerebral edema, where fluid accumulates in the brain, causing confusion, loss of coordination, altered consciousness, and death. This condition can develop within hours and is a medical emergency requiring immediate descent. Physical fitness does not prevent altitude sickness. Highly fit individuals sometimes push through early symptoms, worsening their condition. The morning of the climb, Kira woke with a headache. She mentioned it to her guide, who asked follow-up questions about nausea, dizziness, and appetite. Kira said she felt fine otherwise and attributed the headache to dehydration. She drank water and took pain medication. The group departed early. Kira kept pace easily for the first 2 hours, chatting with other clients and taking photos. By mid-morning, at roughly 11,800 feet, she became quieter. Her guide noticed she was breathing more heavily than expected for the terrain. Later, she stopped and said she felt nauseous. Her guide had her sit, drink water, and eat a snack. She vomited twice. Her guide asked if she wanted to descend, and she said no, insisting it would pass. They continued slowly. By late morning, at around 12,400 feet, Kira was stumbling. Her coordination was off. She missed handholds and clipped into the wrong side of a fixed rope. Her guide stopped the group and assessed her. Her speech was slightly slurred, and she seemed confused about where they were. The guide made the decision to descend immediately. Descent began shortly after. Kira was moving under her own power, but required constant verbal direction. Her guide stayed directly behind her, guiding each step. Within a short time, Kira stopped responding to questions. She stood still, staring blankly at the rock in front of her. Her guide touched her shoulder and repeated her name. She turned slowly, her eyes unfocused. She said she didn't know where she was. Her guide immediately radioed for emergency evacuation and began a rapid, assisted descent, physically guiding Kira's hands and feet. Within minutes, Kira's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the rock, unable to stand. Her guide and a second guide from another nearby group carried her in a semi-seated position, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. Kira's level of consciousness continued to decline. She stopped speaking. Her breathing became irregular, deep, then shallow, then deep again. Her eyes rolled back. She lost consciousness entirely. The guides laid her flat and checked her airway. Her pulse was present but weak and rapid. They continued descent, now carrying her fully. A helicopter was dispatched and reached the location within the hour, landing on a nearby flat section. Kira was loaded and airlifted immediately. She remained unresponsive during the flight. Resuscitation efforts were made en route, but she showed no signs of recovery. Kira was transported to a medical facility in the valley, where she was pronounced dead that afternoon. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of rapid ascent without adequate acclimatization, and continued climbing despite early symptoms of acute mountain sickness. Her physical fitness had no protective effect against the altitude-related condition. The guide's actions were reviewed and deemed appropriate. Descent had been initiated as soon as neurological symptoms were recognized, but the progression had been too rapid. Kira's family was notified that evening. Her body was released several days later and returned to the United States.